She wore her late father's pearls to her own funeral, though no one had died. Not yet, anyway. The woman in white stood at the altar of a chapel that smelled of salt and rot, and the man they were forcing her to marry had not spoken a single word, but he was watching her. And in his ruined eyes, she saw something that should not have been there at all. The fog came thick off Plymouth Harbor that morning, curling around the cobblestones like gray wool. Duchess Helena Ashcombe walked between two of Duke Gilbert's men, her satin slippers soaked through, her hands cold as church stone. She had been summoned at dawn to a chapel at the far end of the docks, the kind of place sailors used to pray before they drowned. She had thought it strange. Now, standing inside its crumbling walls, she understood it was no mistake. It was chosen, remote, forgotten. A place where screams would be swallowed by the gulls. Duke Gilbert stood near the altar, in a coat of deep burgundy velvet, his silver buttons catching what little light leaked through the broken windows. Beside him, draped in emerald silk and dripping with jewels, stood Lady Augusta. Her smile was the sort that never reached the eyes. "Helena, my dear," Gilbert said, spreading his arms as though greeting a guest. "How good of you to come, though I confess you hardly had a choice. What is this?" Helena's voice did not shake, and she was proud of that. "You drag me from my bed before sunrise to a chapel fit for rats. Speak plainly, Gilbert. I am not in the mood for games." Lady Augusta laughed softly. She lifted a stack of papers bound in black ribbon and let them fall onto a wooden bench with a heavy slap. "Then let us be plain," Augusta said. "These are your family's debts, Duchess. Every loan, every unpaid bill, every promissory note your dear departed father signed in his final foolish years." His face was half hidden by a tangle of dark hair and a beard, and across his cheek ran a deep, pale scar that pulled at the corner of his mouth. A beggar, a dockside beggar, reeking of brine and tar. "This," Gilbert announced grandly, "is your bridegroom." Helena's stomach turned. "You cannot be serious." "Oh, I am very serious." Gilbert's smile sharpened. A duchess wed to a mute beggar, stripped of standing, stripped of claim. No court in the land will let a woman married so far beneath her touch a single coin of that fleet. You will sign your inheritance into ruin with your own hand, and you will do it gladly, because the alternative is watching your family starve. The beggar said nothing. He only stood there, head bowed, his great scarred hands hanging loose at his sides. Helena stared at the papers. My father owed nothing. His merchant fleet was the richest in the West Country. You lie. Do I? Gilbert stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper meant only for her. It is wonderful what a clever forger can do with the right ink and the right seal. By tomorrow, every magistrate in England will believe your family is buried in debt to me. Your fleet, your estate, your good name, gone. Your mother turned out into the streets. Your young cousins left to beg. The blood drained from Helena's face. You would not dare. I would dare a great deal to keep you from inheriting that fleet, he said. But I am not a cruel man, Helena. I offer you a way to spare your family the shame. You need only marry. Today. Here. Now. She almost laughed. Marry? Marry whom? That was when they brought him in. The door at the back of the chapel groaned open, and two of Gilbert's men dragged forward a figure that made Helena's breath catch. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, but he wore a coat stitched from salt-stained tarpaulin, the kind thrown over cargo to keep off the rain. A frail old parson, clearly paid well to ask no questions, shuffled forward with the registry book. His hands trembled as he opened it. Sign, Augusta purred, holding out a quill. Helena looked at the registry. She looked at the forged papers that could destroy everyone she loved. She thought of her mother's face. She thought of her small cousins. And then, for one strange moment, she looked at the beggar. He had lifted his head, just slightly. And through the curtain of dark hair, his eyes met hers. And they were not the dull, broken eyes of a man who had lost everything. They were sharp, steady, watchful. The eyes of a man who was paying very close attention to every word Gilbert spoke. It lasted only a heartbeat. Then he dropped his gaze again, the picture of a beaten, witless wretch. Helena's heart pounded. She did not understand it. But something deep within her whispered that things were not as they seemed. She took the quill. She signed her name. The beggar made a clumsy mark beside it. The parson mumbled the rushed words, and it was done. Splendid! Gilbert clapped his hands together. Now, out with you both. You are no longer welcome in respectable company. Go, enjoy your wedded bliss in the gutter where you belong. His men shoved them through the chapel doors and into the cold. The fog closed around Helena and her strange new husband, and the heavy doors slammed shut behind them, leaving them with nothing, nothing at all. Helena stood shivering on the wet cobblestones, alone with a silent stranger, in a city that no longer wanted her. Then the beggar turned to her, and his ruined mouth curved into the faintest, most knowing smile. The smile vanished as quickly as it had come, and the beggar bowed his head once more. Helena pulled her shawl tighter and forced herself to think. Whatever that look had meant, she could not stand frozen in the fog forever. Night would come, and the docks were no place for a woman alone. Come, she said quietly, taking charge as she always had. There is a sailor's tavern near the old ropeworks. It is filthy, but they will give us a corner by the fire for a coin or two. I have a few left, sewn into my hem, enough to keep us from freezing. She started toward the dark alley that led off the wharf. But the beggar did not follow. Instead, he reached out and took her hand. His grip was firm, warm, not the desperate clutch of a starving man, but the steady hold of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Helena turned, startled, ready to scold him. He simply shook his head and drew her in the opposite direction. "That is the wrong way," she protested. "There is nothing down there but the supply yards and the customs sheds. We cannot shelter among barrels of tar." He did not answer. He never did. He only walked, leading her past the shuttered warehouses, past the great stacks of timber, past sleeping mules and coils of heavy rope. Helena's curiosity grew with every step. This was not the wandering of a lost beggar. He knew these streets. He turned each corner without pause, as though he had walked them 100 times. At last, they reached a high brick wall, topped with iron spikes, half hidden behind the naval supply yards. A heavy wooden gate stood within it. The beggar rapped upon it, in a strange rhythm, 3 knocks, a pause, then 2. A small panel slid open. An eye peered out. Then, to Helena's astonishment, the gate swung wide. A man stood waiting in the courtyard beyond. He was old, with a soldier's straight back and a thick gray mustache, and the moment he saw the beggar, his weathered face crumpled with emotion. "My lord," the old man breathed, "you have come back to us." Helena's mouth fell open. The beggar led her across the cobbled yard, through a heavy oak door, and into a study lined with maps and dark wooden shelves. A fire burned low in the grate. Charts of the coastline covered a great table, weighted at the corners with brass instruments. He shut the door behind them. He turned the lock, and then everything changed. The beggar straightened. His shoulders drew back. The slouch fell away from him like a discarded coat, and where a broken wretch had stood a moment before, there now stood a man of bearing and command. He pushed the tangled hair from his brow and looked at Helena, truly looked at her, and when he spoke, His voice was nothing like she expected. It was deep, refined, and edged with the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Forgive the deception, Duchess. It was necessary." Helena stepped back until she felt the table against her spine. "You can speak. I can do a great many things I was pretending I could not." He inclined his head, a gesture of old and practiced courtesy. "Allow me to introduce myself properly. I am Thomas Hartwell, Admiral Lord of the Western Fleet, and a Duke of this realm, though I confess the title has gone unused for some time." She stared at him. "That is impossible. Admiral Hartwell is dead. His flagship vanished a year past. All of England mourned him. There were memorial services. I attended one myself. Then you attended the funeral of a living man." A grim humor touched his scarred mouth. "My ship did not sink by accident or storm, Duchess. We were betrayed, lured into the path of privateers who knew our every move. Our course, our cargo, our hour of passing. They struck in the dark. My crew scattered. I survived, washed ashore half drowned. And when I crawled back to the world of the living, I made a discovery that changed everything." He moved to the fire, the firelight carving shadows across the scar on his cheek. "Whoever betrayed us was no foreign enemy. He was English. He was powerful. And he was watching the ports for any sign that I still breathed. So I let them believe the sea had taken me. I dressed in rags. I learned to hold my tongue. A silent beggar sees everything and is suspected of nothing. For a year I have haunted these docks, listening, gathering, waiting for the man behind it all to show his hand." Helena's mind raced back to the chapel, to the way he had watched Gilbert, to the sharpness in his eyes. "This morning," she said slowly, "at the chapel, you were not surprised to be there." "No." Thomas turned to face her. "I let Gilbert's men take me from the gutter and dress me as a groom. I let him believe he had found a mute wretch to ruin you with, because the man I have hunted for a year, the man who sent my crew to their deaths," his jaw tightened, "is Duke Gilbert himself, and today, by his own arrogance, he placed his greatest enemy directly at his side, and never knew it." The fire cracked in the silence. Helena pressed a hand to her chest, her heart hammering. Hours ago, she had been the most wretched woman in Plymouth, married off to a beggar to be cast into the gutter. Now she stood in a guarded fortress beside a man returned from the dead, and they shared the very same enemy. "Then you and I," she said carefully, "want the same thing." Thomas met her eyes, and this time the smile that touched his lips was real. "We do, Duchess. We very much do." They left Plymouth before the next dawn. The carriage that carried them was plain and black, with no crest upon its doors and no name upon its lamps. Thomas had chosen it for that very reason. A grand coach drew eyes, and eyes carried tales back to Gilbert. So they rode in something a country parson might use, the curtains drawn tight, the wheels rattling over rough roads as they wound their way deep into the green hills of Devon. Helena had slept little. She sat across from Thomas now, watching the morning light slip through a gap in the curtain, and the weight of the past day pressed upon her like a stone. Yesterday she had been Duchess Ashcombe, heir to the greatest fleet in the West Country. Now she was a fugitive in a borrowed coach, wed to a dead man. "You are very quiet," Thomas said. "I am trying to decide whether I have lost my mind." She managed a weary smile. "A week ago, my greatest worry was the spring accounts. Now I am told my husband is an admiral. My home is built on forged debts, and the man who ruined me also finched a fleet of the king's sailors. It is a great deal to carry." "It is." She looked at him steadily. "But I have buried my father, run his affairs alone, against men who thought a woman too soft to do it, and survived a wedding meant to break me." "I do not break easily, my lord," So if we share an enemy, then let us stop trading sorrows and start trading what we know. Something in Thomas's expression shifted. A flicker of respect, perhaps even surprise. Spoken like a commander. Very well. By midday, the carriage turned through a pair of iron gates and up a long drive lined with old oaks. At its end stood a quiet stone manor, ivy climbing its walls, its windows shuttered against the world. No servants gossiped on its steps. No neighbors peered from nearby lanes. It was a house meant to be forgotten, and that was exactly why Thomas had kept it. Inside, a fire had been laid, and a simple meal set out by the single old caretaker, who tended the place. Thomas spread a great chart of the southern coast across the table, the same one Helena had glimpsed in the study. "Now," he said, "tell me of your father's affairs. You said you ran his firm. Did anything trouble him in his final months? Anything that did not sit right?" Helena went still. The question struck a memory she had pushed aside in her grief. "Yes," she said slowly. "Yes. There was something. The autumn before he died, my father grew restless. He would sit up late over his ledgers, muttering. I thought it was only the worry of an aging man." She pressed her fingers to her temple, drawing the memory closer. But it was the routes, the coastal trade routes. He found that ships were being ordered to sail strange paths, long, looping courses that wasted days and cost a fortune in wages and supplies. No sensible merchant would send a vessel so far out of its way. Thomas had gone very still himself. Go on. He could not understand it. The orders bore proper seals and proper signatures, yet they made no sense. He began to keep a private record of these voyages. The dates, the waters they were sent through. He swore something was wrong, that the figures hid a deeper rot. Her voice softened. He died before he could prove it. I always thought it was an old man's fancy. I let the matter rest. Thomas leaned over the chart. "Show me, as near as you can recall. Where were these ships sent?" Helena rose and bent over the map. Her finger traced the coastline, calling up the figures she had copied so many times in her father's ledgers. Here, past the Lizard, then out wide. Here, toward the deep channel, and along this stretch, off the Cornish points, again and again. He marked these waters most of all. For a long moment, Thomas said nothing. His face had drained of all its color. He took up a pencil and, with a hand that was not entirely steady, marked a row of small crosses along the very same stretches of water Helena had named. "Do you know what these are?" he asked quietly. "No. These are the waters where my fleet was ambushed." He set the pencil down. "Every one of them. The Lizard, the deep channel, the Cornish points. My ships were struck in these exact places, at night, by men who knew precisely where we would be." He looked up at her, and his gray eyes burned. "Your father's merchant vessels were not wandering by mistake, Helena. They were being sent ahead, sent to test the waters, to scout the patrols and chart the safe hours, so that when my fleet sailed those same paths, the privateers would be waiting in the dark." Helena's hand flew to her mouth. "My father's ships were used to set the trap? Without his knowledge, I would wager, someone within his own firm bent his vessels to a darker purpose, and your father caught the scent of it before he died." Thomas's jaw tightened. That is why he had to be silenced. Not by blade or poison, but by debts and forgery and ruin, so that no one would ever believe a word he had written. The room seemed to spin. Helena sank into a chair, the truth settling over her like cold water. Her father had not died a broken, foolish man. He had died because he had come too close. "Then we are not merely chasing my inheritance," she whispered. "We are clearing his name and avenging my crew." Thomas placed his scarred hand flat upon the chart. The same hand drew both our miseries. Duchess, Now we shall trace it back to the wrist. They reached London 3 days later, dusty and aching from the road. The mail coach had carried them fast, changing horses at every post-in, the driver cracking his whip through the night to keep his schedule. Thomas and Helena had traveled under false names, Mr. and Mrs. Pell, a quiet merchant couple come to settle a tedious matter of cargo. No one looked twice at them. That was the point. Gone was the salt-stained tarpaulin. Gone, too, was Helena's fine satin. Thomas now wore a plain wool frock coat of dull brown, the sort worn by a clerk of middling fortune, his beard trimmed close and his hair tied back. Helena wore a simple gray gown and a modest bonnet, her father's pearls hidden away. They looked entirely ordinary, and ordinary was a kind of armor. "The custom house," Thomas said as their hired cab rattled along the Thames. "Every ship that enters the port of London must declare its cargo there. Every manifest, every bill of lading, every record of who shipped what and where. If your family's vessels were sent on those strange voyages, the proof will be buried in those archives." Helena gazed out at the great building as it came into view, a long, grand front of pale stone facing the river, its many windows glinting in the morning light. Clerks and merchants streamed in and out like ants from a hill. The noise of the quay was tremendous, shouting porters, creaking cranes, the slap of water against 100 hulls. "It will be guarded," she said, "not by soldiers, by tedium." Thomas helped her down from the cab. "The archives are watched by a chief clerk and a small army of bored copyists, men who guard paper, not gold. They expect thieves to want silver. They never expect anyone to want old shipping logs." He offered his arm. "Remember, you are Mrs. Pell, and you are very, very dull." She almost laughed. "I shall do my best to bore them senseless." Inside, the great hall echoed with the scratch of pens and the murmur of business. They made their way to the records office, where shelves rose to the ceiling, stuffed with bound ledgers and bundles of papers tied in faded ribbon. Behind a tall desk sat the chief clerk, a thin, severe man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles perched on a sharp nose. Thomas approached him at once, his manner transformed into that of a flustered, slightly pompous merchant. "You there, clerk, I've a grievance, and I'll have it set right today." He slapped a folded paper upon the desk. "My cargo manifest. The figures are all wrong. I'm charged duty on 40 casks when I shipped but 30. 40. Do I look a fool to you? I demand you find the original entry and correct this robbery at once." The chief clerk sighed the sigh of a man who had heard 10,000 such complaints. "Sir, if you would simply—" "I will not simply anything. 40 casks, 30 shipped." Thomas leaned over the desk, jabbing his finger at the paper, drawing the man's full and irritated attention. "Now fetch your great book and show me where this error crept in, or I shall take the matter to your superior." While the chief clerk bent over the manifest, muttering, Helena slipped quietly down the aisle of shelves. Her heart beat fast, but her steps were calm. She had spent her whole life among ledgers. She knew how merchants ordered their records, how they hid the things they did not wish found. Her father had used a system all his own, a private code of small marks in the margins, a way of cross-referencing voyages that no outside clerk would understand. If his vessel's logs had passed through this place, his hand would have left its trace. She ran her finger along the spines, reading the labels. Inbound, outbound, impounded. She paused at that last word. Impounded, records seized and set aside, removed from common view. She pulled the heavy volume free and opened it upon a reading stand, turning the pages with practiced speed. There. A small looping mark in the corner of an entry, no larger than a fly's wing. Her breath caught. It was her father's mark, the symbol he used to flag a voyage he distrusted. She followed it like a thread through a maze. The mark led her to a reference number, and the reference number led her to a shelf set apart from the rest, half hidden behind a pillar. A row of slim packets, sealed with wax and tied with cord, each bearing the names of her family's ships. Her hands trembled as she gathered them. The Marigold, the St. Cuthbert, the Ashcombe Pride, her father's own flagship. These were the impounded logs of the very voyages he had questioned, locked away where no one would ever think to look. Behind her, Thomas's voice rose in fresh outrage. 30 casks, man! Are you deaf as well as careless? Helena worked quickly. She could not take the great bound ledger, but the slim sealed packets she could. She tucked them deep into the lining of her cloak, where her father's pearls had hidden before, and smoothed the fabric flat. Then she stepped from behind the pillar and walked back toward the desk, her face the very picture of wifely impatience. "Husband," she said sweetly, "you have argued the morning away. The man has clearly done his best. Let us trouble him no further." The chief clerk shot her a look of pure gratitude. Thomas huffed and grumbled and allowed himself to be led away, snatching up his manifest as though it were a great victory. They passed out through the echoing hall and into the bright bustle of the quay, and only when they had turned a corner, well out of sight, did Helena let out the breath she had been holding.
"I have them,"
she whispered, pressing a hand to her cloak. "His logs. The proof." Thomas's eyes gleamed. "Then let us go and read what your father died to hide." The lodging Thomas had taken sat above a quiet chandler's shop, with a single window that looked out over the grey sweep of the Thames. By candlelight, the two of them spread the sealed packets across the table and began to read. Helena broke the wax with care, her fingers steady now. The logs were written in the cramped hands of various ship's masters, but threaded through them, in the margins, were her father's own notes. She read them aloud, translating his private code as she went, and Thomas listened, his face growing darker with each entry. "Here," she said, "the Marigold, ordered south past the Lizard in October, though her cargo was bound for Bristol. A voyage 3 days longer than it needed to be." She turned a page. "And here my father has written, 'No reason given. Master says orders came sealed from the office.' Whose hand?" He was asking the right question. Thomas pulled another packet toward him. "The St. Cuthbert, sent through the deep channel at night, lanterns dimmed. A merchant ship has no cause to dim her lanterns, unless someone wished to learn whether the channel could be crossed unseen. They worked through the small hours, and a terrible pattern took shape. Her father's vessels had been used one by one to chart the patrols, to test the dock, to map the safe passages, and then those very maps had been handed to the men who lay in wait for Thomas's fleet. But it was the last packet that made Helena gasp. It was not a log at all. It was a single sheet, newer than the rest, slipped in among the old papers. A schedule. A list of her family's remaining ships, with dates and a column of foreign names. Thomas. Her voice had gone thin. "These are sales. My ships. He means to sell them off. Not at auction, not openly, but quietly, to buyers across the water." She pointed to the topmost line, her hand shaking. 3 vessels, the Ashcombe Pride among them, sold and handed over tonight. Thomas was at her side in an instant, reading over her shoulder. "Tonight. Look, the wharf is named here, St. Saviour's Dock, and the hour, midnight. He is stripping my family bare while we sit here." Helena rose, her chair scraping. "Once those ships pass into foreign hands under foreign names, they are gone. No court will ever trace them. We will have lost everything, and the proof of his treachery along with it. Then we shall not lose them." Thomas was already reaching for his coat. "Gilbert's agents believe themselves unwatched. They will work in the dark, quietly, expecting no trouble. That is their weakness, and it shall be their undoing. What can the two of us do against a wharf full of his men? The two of us, nothing. A grim smile touched his mouth. But I did not return from the dead alone, Helena. I have officers, men of my fleet who survived that night, who have waited a year for the chance to set things right. They are scattered through this city, and a word from me will gather them within the hour. He scrawled a note, sealed it, and pressed it into the hand of the chandler's boy below, with a coin and an address. Then they waited, and the waiting was the hardest part. By midnight, they stood in the shadows near St. Saviour's dock. The fog had rolled in once more, soft and gray, and the river lapped quietly at the wooden piers. And out of that fog, one by one, came men. Weathered, hard-eyed men in plain coats, moving without a sound. They gathered around Thomas, and Helena watched as each one's face changed at the sight of him. The same disbelief, the same flood of loyalty she had seen at the gate in Plymouth. "My lord," murmured the foremost, an old sailing master named Barrow, "we thought you drowned with the rest." "I very nearly was." Thomas clasped the man's shoulder. "Tonight we begin to repay them. No blades drawn unless I command it. We catch them in the act, and we hand them to the law. That is all. Understood?" The men nodded. At the wharf below, lanterns moved. 3 of Helena's ships lay moored in the dark water, and around them figures crept like rats. As Thomas and his men drew silently closer, Helena saw what the agents were doing. They had set ladders against the hulls, and with chisels and paint they were working at the nameplates, prying off the carved letters of her family's vessels, ready to fix new names in their place. The Ashcombe pride, her father's pride, was being made to vanish before her eyes. "Now," Thomas said softly. His men moved like a closing net. They came from the shadows on every side, swift and quiet, and before the agents understood what was happening, they were surrounded. One overseer dropped his chisel with a clatter and made to run, only to find a broad-shouldered officer barring his path. Another raised his lantern, mouth open to shout, but a firm hand closed over his arm, and a low voice told him to be still. There was no fighting, no blood, only the sudden, dreadful realization on the faces of Gilbert's men that they had been caught. Helena stepped forward into the lantern light, and the chief overseer's face went slack with shock. "You," he stammered, "you're meant to be ruined, cast out." "I am the rightful owner of these ships," she said, her voice ringing clear across the wharf, "and you are thieves caught with the chisel still in your hand." Thomas turned to the river stairs, where the port constables had been quietly summoned, and now climbed into view. "These men have been altering the nameplates of impounded vessels and conspiring to sell them unlawfully. I give them into your charge." The constables took hold of the overseers, who were too stunned to resist. As they were led away into the fog, Helena looked down at the half-stripped nameplate of her father's flagship. "We have him now," she said. "Not yet," Thomas murmured. "But the net is drawing tight." Sleep did not come easily that night, but when morning broke, Helena woke with a memory burning clear in her mind. She sat up so suddenly that she startled the chandler's cat from the windowsill. Thomas, already dressed and studying the seized logs by daylight, looked up. "You have thought of something." "My father." Helena pushed back her hair. "He kept a box, a private safe deposit box at a law firm in Lincoln's Inn Fields, Hartright and Sons, the most respectable solicitors in London. He told me once that if anything ever happened to him, I was to go there and ask for it. I had forgotten entirely. In my grief, it slipped away from me." She rose quickly. "He would not have spoken of it so gravely over nothing, Thomas. Whatever he feared, whatever he gathered, it may be sitting in that box, this very moment." Thomas was already reaching for his coat. "Then we go at once." They took a brougham across the waking city. the small enclosed carriage threading through streets that smelled of coal smoke and fresh bread. Lincoln's Inn Fields opened before them, a green square ringed by tall, dignified buildings where the law went about its quiet, ancient business. The offices of Hartright and Sons stood behind a polished black door with a brass plate worn smooth by years of hands. A grave old clerk received them. When Helena gave her father's name and produced her family signet ring, his manner changed at once. He bowed and led them down a paneled corridor to a private room, where a heavy iron strongbox was brought forth and set upon the table. "Your late father's instructions were most particular, madam," the clerk said. The box was to be opened only by the bearer of the Ashcombe ring. He was a careful gentleman. He withdrew, closing the door softly behind him. Helena pressed the seal of her ring into the wax that bound the box, and the latch gave way. She lifted the lid. Inside lay a bundle of letters, tied with cord, and beneath them a ledger bound in dark leather. Her breath caught at the sight of her father's familiar hand. "He left it all here," she whispered. "Everything he could not say aloud." She lifted the first letter and unfolded it. As she read, the blood drained slowly from her face. "This is not my father's writing," she said. "These are letters he intercepted or copied. Look," she held the page toward Thomas. "They are addressed to Duke Gilbert, and they contain coordinates. See coordinates, dates, the movements of British naval patrols. Whoever wrote these knew exactly when and where the king's ships would sail." Thomas took the letter, and his hand tightened until the paper crackled. "These are the patrol schedules, the very ones that were used against my fleet. Someone fed Gilbert the Navy's secrets, voyage by voyage." He turned the page over, and there at the foot of it, pressed into a coin of dark red wax, was a seal. He went utterly still. "Helena, this seal." His voice had dropped to something low and dangerous. "Do you know it?" She leaned close. The wax bore the impression of a delicate design, a sprig of laurel wound about a single star. "I have seen it before," she said slowly. "On invitations, on letters of society." Her eyes widened. "It is Lady Augusta's. It is her personal seal. She uses it on all her private correspondence." The room seemed to hold its breath. "Then it was not Gilbert alone," Thomas said. "The letters were written to him, but they were sealed by her. She did not merely stand at his side and smile. She was the hand that gathered the Navy's secrets and passed them on." He set the letter down with great care, as though it might burn him. "I had thought her his ornament, his vain and pretty shadow. I was wrong. She is the cleverer of the two by far." Helena turned the pages of the ledger beneath, and here her father's own hand returned, neat and damning. He had tracked it all, the strange voyages of his ships, the dates they matched against rumors of naval losses, the payments that flowed from foreign buyers into accounts he could not name. And on the final page, in writing that grew unsteady, as though set down in haste or fear, he had written a single line. Helena read it aloud, her voice trembling. "G&A together. They mean to own every channel from Plymouth to the Thames. My ships are their stalking horse. God forgive me for what they have used my fleet to do. If I am silenced, let this box speak in my place." The silence stretched long between them. "He knew," Helena said. "He knew they would come for him. And still he had the courage to write it down." A tear slipped down her cheek, but her voice did not break. "They took his good name. They made the world believe he died a foolish, ruined man. And all the while, he was the only honest soul in the whole affair." Thomas reached across the table and laid his scarred hand over hers. It was the first time he had touched her with anything but command, and the gentleness of it surprised them both. "Your father will have his name back," he said quietly. "I swear it upon my own. These letters, these accounts, his own words in his own hand, together they are a noose. Gilbert and Augusta forged a web of lies to bury us both. Now their own correspondence will hang them. Helena wiped her cheek and gathered the letters with care, binding them once more in their cord. Then where do we take it? Such proof is worth nothing if no one of power will hear it. To the only men in England with the authority to undo all of this. Thomas rose, and the old admiral stood tall in him once more. To the Admiralty itself, it is time, Helena, that I returned from the dead in earnest. The morning they went to the Admiralty, Thomas Hartwell shed the last of his disguise. Helena watched the transformation with quiet wonder. Gone was the trimmed beard of the dull merchant Mr. Pell. Gone was the salt-stained beggar she had been wed to in the fog. A barber had come at dawn, and now Thomas stood clean-shaven, the long scar upon his cheek plain to see, but it no longer looked like the mark of a broken man. Upon a uniform of dark navy blue, with gold braid at the shoulders and a row of hard-won medals across the breast, it looked like the badge of a man who had survived what should have finished him. He had kept the uniform hidden all this time, folded away against this very hour. Helena, too, had set aside her gray disguise. She wore a gown of deep wine-colored velvet, simple but rich, her father's pearls at her throat once more. She no longer looked like a fugitive. She looked like what she was, a duchess, and the daughter of an honest man. "You look every inch the admiral," she said, "and you, every inch the duchess." Thomas offered his arm. "Let us go and wake the dead then, starting with me." The Admiralty headquarters was a grand and solemn building, its corridors hung with portraits of old sea lords and the great battles of the past. Clerks in black hurried past with bundles of papers. The air smelled of beeswax and old wood, and the particular hush of a place where serious men decided serious things. They were made to wait, of course. A man returning from the grave does not walk straight into the chamber of the senior board. But Thomas had sent word ahead, in his own true name, and that name still carried weight. After an hour, a steward came and led them through a set of tall doors into a long room where the board sat behind a great curved table. There were 5 of them, elderly men, gold-braided and grave, their faces lined with decades at sea and in council. They had gathered, expecting some impostor, some madman, trading on a dead hero's name. Helena saw it in their guarded expressions. Then Thomas stepped fully into the light, and the room changed. The eldest of them, a white-haired admiral named Lord Penhale, half rose from his chair, his cup rattling against its saucer. "Good God," he breathed. "Hartwell, it cannot be. We buried you. We read the service ourselves. You buried an empty coffin, my lord." Thomas bowed with perfect courtesy. "I have been a year in the dark, and I have come at last into the light, because I carry proof that the loss of my fleet was no accident of war. Plotted, paid for, and carried out by Englishmen." A murmur ran round the table. One of the younger members frowned. "These are grave words, Admiral. The loss of your flagship and her companions was mourned across the realm. To call it something that serious, you must have more than grief to stand upon." "I have more than grief." Thomas turned. "Duchess?" Helena stepped forward and laid their evidence upon the great table, piece by piece, as calmly as she had once laid out the accounts of her father's firm. She had ordered it all the night before, and she presented it now with the clear, unhurried voice of someone who knew her facts could not be shaken. "My lords, these are the impounded logs of my family's merchant vessels, taken from the custom house." She set them down. "They show our ships were sent on senseless voyages through the very waters where the king's fleet was later ambushed, sent to chart the patrols and test the dark. My father, who owned those ships, discovered the scheme and was destroyed for it. She placed the bundle of letters beside the logs. These letters carry the secret movements of British naval patrols, the same schedules used to lay the trap. They are addressed to Duke Gilbert of Plymouth, and they bear the personal seal of Lady Augusta Vane. The room had gone very quiet. "And this," Helena said, laying down the leather ledger, "is my father's own record, in his own hand, naming them both before he died." She opened it to the final page. He wrote that they meant to own every shipping channel from Plymouth to the Thames, and that his fleet was made their stalking horse without his knowledge. Lord Penhale took up the letters with trembling hands. He read one, then another, comparing the coordinates against a chart a steward hurried to fetch. The other members leaned in, passing the pages between them, their faces hardening with every line. "These patrol routes," Penhale said at last, his voice grim. "They are accurate, dangerously so. No common merchant could have known them. This is naval intelligence, gentlemen, stolen and sold." He looked up at Thomas, and there was fury in his old eyes now, and grief and shame. "Your crew, 300 good men, sent to slaughter by a duke and his lady, for the price of a shipping monopoly." "That is the whole of it, my lord," Thomas said quietly. Penhale rose to his full height, and the others rose with him. "Then the board will not sit idle, while the men who did this go free." He turned to the steward. "Bring the warrant book." Within the hour it was done. The senior board granted Thomas Hartwell a supreme warrant, restoring his titles, his rank, and his standing as Admiral Lord of the Western Fleet, dead no longer. And by the same warrant they froze every transaction touching the Ashcombe estate and fleet, halting Gilbert's schemes where they stood. Penhale pressed the sealed warrant into Thomas's hands. "Go and finish this, Admiral, with the full authority of the board behind you." As they left the chamber, Helena glanced at Thomas. "They believed us. They believed your father," he said. "He built the case that hanged them. We have only carried it the last mile." That same evening, while London glittered with candlelight, Duke Gilbert raised a glass of fine claret and toasted his own triumph. He had no notion that his world had already ended. The Merchant Exchange was the grandest hall in the city for such affairs, a vast room of marble columns and gilded ceilings, where the wealthy came to buy and sell fortunes over wine. Tonight it was crowded with men of money, ship owners, foreign buyers, and lords who smelled a bargain. They had come at Gilbert's private invitation to bid upon the famous Ashcombe fleet, the greatest merchant fleet in England, now, so they believed, forfeit and for sale. At the front of the hall stood a raised podium, and behind it sat Gilbert himself, resplendent in cream and gold, an ivory gavel resting beneath his hand. Beside him, draped in silver silk and diamonds, sat Lady Augusta, her smile serene, her eyes cool as she surveyed the crowd of buyers like a hawk surveying a field of mice. "My friends," Gilbert announced, rising, "you have come to witness a rare occasion, the dissolution of a great house and the dividing of its spoils. The Ashcombe name, once so proud, has fallen into ruin, debts beyond counting, a family disgraced. It falls to me, as the holder of those debts, to see its fleet pass into worthier hands. Your hands." A ripple of greedy laughter ran through the room. "Let us begin with the jewel of the fleet, the flagship herself, the Ashcombe Pride." He lifted the ivory gavel. "The bidding opens at—" The great oak doors at the end of the hall flew open with a crash that echoed off the marble. Every head turned. The laughter died in 100 throats. Through the doorway came a column of Royal Marines in scarlet coats, muskets at their shoulders, boots striking the floor in perfect unison. They split, and lined the center aisle, forming a corridor down the length of the hall, and down that corridor walked two figures. Thomas Hartwell came first, tall and unhurried, in his dark blue uniform, blazing with gold braid and medals, the scar upon his cheek catching the candlelight. Beside him, her chin high, her wine velvet gown sweeping the marble, walked Helena, the pearls at her throat, her father's daughter to the last inch. The gavel slipped from Gilbert's hand and clattered to the floor. For a long, frozen moment, no one in the great hall breathed. Then the whispers began, rushing through the crowd like wind through dry grass. "It cannot be. Admiral Hartwell, he's dead, surely. That is the Ashcombe woman, the one who was ruined." Gilbert's face had gone the color of ash. He gripped the edge of the podium, his mouth working, no sound coming out. Beside him, Lady Augusta had risen slowly from her seat, and for the first time, Helena saw the serene mask slip from her face. Beneath it was something sharp and frightened and calculating, an animal sensing the closing of a trap. Thomas and Helena reached the foot of the podium and stopped. Thomas let the silence hold a moment longer, let every eye in the room fix upon him. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner, without his needing to raise it. "Forgive the interruption to your sail, Gilbert." His tone was almost pleasant, and all the more terrible for it. "But you are attempting to sell ships that are not yours, on the strength of debts that never existed, belonging to a man you tried very hard to bury at the bottom of the sea." A gasp went through the assembled buyers. They began to draw back from the podium, the way men step away from something they do not wish to be caught standing near. Gilbert found his voice at last, though it shook. This is some trick. Hartwell drowned a year past. This is an impostor. A fraud got up in a dead man's coat. Marines, seize these intruders." Not a single Marine moved. They stood at attention, their eyes fixed forward, awaiting only Thomas's word. "They take their orders from the senior board of the Admiralty," Thomas said. "As of this morning, so does every officer of the Crown in this city." He drew a folded document from within his coat and held it aloft, the great red seal of the Admiralty plain, for all to see. "A supreme warrant. My titles restored, my name cleared, and every transaction touching the Ashcombe estate frozen by order of the board. You are selling nothing tonight, Gilbert. You have no ships, no debts, and very soon no liberty." Lady Augusta stepped forward then, smooth and quick, her hands spread in appeal to the crowd. "Gentlemen, you are being deceived. Whatever papers this man waves about, they prove nothing against us. We are persons of standing, of reputation." Persons of standing. Helena's voice cut clear across the hall, and the crowd turned to her. She held up the bundle of letters, tied in their cord. "These letters bear your seal, Lady Augusta, the sprig of laurel and the star. They carry the secret movements of His Majesty's Navy, the very routes used to lure 300 sailors to their deaths." Her voice did not waver. "My father discovered what you were doing with his ships. So you forged his debts and broke his name, and let the world call him a fool. He is not here to defend himself tonight, so I shall do it for him." The whole room was staring at Augusta now. The serene composure had wholly crumbled. Her face was white, her jaw tight, her eyes darting toward the doors as though gauging the distance. "You have nothing," she hissed. "Nothing but ink and accusation. We have your own hand, your own seal, and a dead man's honest ledger," Thomas said. "It will be more than enough." He turned toward the rear of the hall and lifted one hand. From the shadows beyond the Marines stepped the magistrates of the Admiralty, grave in their robes, an official decree held ready between them. Gilbert sank slowly back into his chair, and the ivory gavel lay forgotten on the marble at his feet. The eldest of the Admiralty magistrates unrolled the decree, and the great hall fell so silent that the guttering of the candles could be heard. He read in a slow, weighty voice that carried to every corner of the marble room. The charges were grave, and many: corporate fraud, the forging of debts, conspiracy against the crown, and the unlawful sale of impounded vessels. By the authority of the Senior Board of the Admiralty and the Courts of Law, every bank account held by Duke Gilbert and Lady Augusta Vane was frozen from that moment. Every property, every coin, every ill-gotten gain seized into the keeping of the court, to be answered for at public tribunal. As the words fell, the wealthy buyers who had come to feast on the Ashcombe fortune now edged toward the doors, eager to be gone, desperate not to be counted among the friends of two ruined traitors. Gilbert did not rise. He sat slumped in his fine chair, the cream and gold of his coat suddenly looking like a costume on a fading man. All his cleverage, all his forged papers, all his schemes had been built upon the belief that Thomas Hartwell lay dead and Helena Ashcombe lay broken. With both of them standing before him, alive and vindicated, he had nothing left to stand on at all. Lady Augusta fought longer. "This is monstrous," she said, turning to the magistrates, her voice climbing. "We are people of rank. You cannot drag us through the streets like common thieves on the word of a scarred sailor and a disgraced girl." "The word of an admiral of the Western Fleet," corrected Lord Penhale, who had come himself to see the matter finished. "And the word of a duchess, whose name this court has restored in full." He nodded to the High Sheriff. "Take them." The sheriff and his men stepped forward. There was no struggle worth the name. Gilbert allowed himself to be raised from his chair, his eyes empty. Augusta drew herself up with the last of her pride and walked out between the officers with her chin high, though her hands trembled at her sides. The doors of the Merchant Exchange closed behind them, and the long shadow they had cast over two families closed with them. Helena let out a breath she felt she had been holding for a year. Thomas turned to her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There was nothing more to fight. It was simply, finally, over. A day later, they came to the grand Hartwell estate. It stood among the green hills, a great house of honey-colored stone, with tall windows and gardens running down to a quiet lake. It had stood empty in its master's absence, draped in dust sheets, mourned and shuttered. Now the shutters were thrown wide, and the household had gathered upon the front steps to receive the man they had buried in their hearts a year before. The old steward who had once guarded the Plymouth gate stood at the head of them, and when the carriage drew up and Thomas stepped down in his blue uniform, the old man's composure broke entirely. He bowed so low that Thomas had to step forward and raise him by the shoulders. "Welcome home, my lord," the steward managed. "Welcome home at last." One by one the household came forward. The housekeeper, the gardeners, the maids and grooms who had served the Hartwell name across the years. And one by one, Thomas greeted them, calling many by name, for he had not forgotten a single face in all his time in the dark. Then he turned and held out his hand to Helena, drawing her up the steps to stand beside him. "This," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled household, "is Helena, daughter of as honest a merchant as ever sailed an English ship, and the rightful mistress of the greatest fleet in England. She is my wife, in truth as well as in law. She is your Duchess, and you will serve her as you serve me." The household bowed as one. Helena, who had been married off in a rotting chapel with nothing to her name but borrowed pearls and forged debts, felt her eyes sting. Later, when the welcome was done and the house had settled into the warm bustle of a home brought back to life, the two of them walked together in the garden as the sun went down over the lake. "It is strange," Helena said. "A fortnight ago you were a silent beggar in a tarpaulin coat, and I was certain my life was finished. Now I do not know quite what we are." Thomas smiled, the real smile, the one she had first glimpsed in the Plymouth fog. "We are partners, I should think. We began as two people ruined by the same hand. We end as two people who set the matter right together." He paused. "I will not pretend our marriage began as anything but a cruelty done to us both. But I have come to think that of all the schemes Gilbert ever laid, the one that bound me to you was the only good thing he ever did, though he never meant it so." Helena laughed softly. "Then we have him to thank." "We have your father to thank," Thomas said, more quietly. "He saw it all. He wrote it down, knowing it might cost him everything, on the chance that one day someone would read it and set things right. He never knew it would be his own daughter." He looked at her. "His name will be honored in this house for as long as it stands. I have already given the order." Helena turned to look out over the water, the pearls warm at her throat, the great house glowing gold behind them. Her father's fleet would sail again under her direction. The traitors would answer to the law. The dead admiral lived, and the ruined Duchess had become the mistress of one of the finest estates in England. The fog of Plymouth felt very far away now. "Home," she said softly, trying the word. "Home," Thomas agreed. And so it was. Arrests,